Hey, this is the chair guy. After my last video, someone was asking about chromatics, which is something I've got to admit I really didn't want to talk about, not because I don't find them extremely interesting, but because even though chromatics are kind of simple, they are hard to describe how to use them. So I'm just going to give a few simplistic ideas to you just so you can understand what this is and hopefully apply it because it really is very interesting. All chromatics mean is that you're not necessarily following the ratios that we have in Western music. In other words, for instance, we would have a scale. That's G all the way back to G. And there's other ways you can do that. You don't have to follow those ratios. For instance, you could just play all of those notes in a row. And of course, you could play any other combination of those notes. A scale is really just a way of deciding what note you're going to use for a given piece. And the reason I usually revolve everything around, I don't know, let's call them the Western ratios, is because that is what most people are used to, and that is what sounds good to most people. But it is really cool to experiment with other ways of doing things, and chromatics are a great way to do that. So, for instance, some chords might sound dissonant. Let's say we have our E minor. If we took that same shape and we moved it here and here, that might sound dissonant. But you notice with those second two chords, they kind of sounded good together, even though they weren't all from the same key. And that's because chords and notes can have a relationship just to each other. In other words, if you play them in a row, like I did with this scale, that kind of sounds interesting, even though you aren't playing them from a scale, or at least you're playing them from the chromatic scale, you could say. So, for instance, if we let's try this E minor chord again, but let's play it chromatically down the neck. Now what I did there was I played the exact same shape, so we have E minor chord shapes, but I'm just playing them until I get another minor chord that is in the scale, and then I'm going back to E. So this E minor is actually the same chord as this. And but of course I can't go high enough, or I can't go low enough on the neck, depending how you want to look at that, to get to another E minor, so I'm just going over to get to that E minor. And so these are things that you're welcome to experiment with. I think there's really cool stuff you can do with it. It's just hard to give you hard rules for how to do it, because it really is, it's a place where music gets a little bit esoteric, and I actually love the places where music gets esoteric, but it also gets harder to explain. Now keep in mind, we could go up the neck. Again, we've gotten to that A minor, and we could keep going down until we got to E minor, and we would get different meanings from that. In other words, we get a certain musical meaning when we go chromatically to another chord that's in the key, and then of course resolving back to the original note. So chromatics can work or generally do work in a very similar way. You're still starting on a note, and you're more than likely going to resolve back to that note. Not always. There are always exceptions to these rules, but this is an area where music can get really interesting. So, you know, experiment, have fun. That is the beauty about music. There are no real rules in music. Music theory is just there to show you perhaps the most obvious way to make something sound good. And there are all kinds of interesting things that we can do to make music sound more interesting. I think that's often the way I look at it, is that if you're playing according to a key, you're being a little more obvious, and you're doing something that's going to be very easy to relate to. And the further you deviate from those, let's call them guidelines, the more abstract you will become, and the harder it may be for your audience to relate to what you're doing. But you aren't always making music just to relate to audiences, or not to relate so obviously to audiences. And it's really kind of cool when you do come up with something that sounds interesting, that audiences do relate to, even if it doesn't fit within the normal rules of Western music theory, whatever that really means. So anyway, have fun with it, guys.